Dear colleagues, friends, Gabi and Emily, I'm very honored to open the first session of the Today conference dedicated to Motzkin. And I have a double role as my former colleagues. First to introduce the speaker and then to offer a short response to his lecture. So I will first say a few words on Ben Hutchinson, a professor of European literature at the University of Kent, published widely on German, French, and English literature, including the monographs on Rilke and the Poetics of Becoming, on Winfried Georg Sebald and the Dialektische Imagination, then on modernism and style, and on lateness and modern European literature. Ben was also active as a critic, writing in journals, including the Time Literary Supplement, The Observer, and the Literary Review. In 2016, this year, he was elected as a Fellow of the Academy of Europe. And his lecture today is titled Late Reading, Culture, Criticism, and Modes of Modernity. Ben?
Thank you. Well, I would very much like to add to echo the encomia that have been issued in praise of Gabi throughout the course of today, but the truth is I'm not in a position to do so because we haven't known each other for long enough. So as one of his younger friends, I would rather focus on the future and merely say that Van Leer's loss is very much the gain of Berlin, California, Glasgow, and wherever else. And if I would wish you one thing, Gabi, it would be to continue being active. East or west, work is best, it seems to me. I think you will. I think we can safely say that. So, when Gabi was generous enough to invite me to contribute to this valedictory conference, an honor of which I'm deeply sensible, it was immediately apparent to me that the occasion, no less than the man, demanded as broad a perspective as possible. To focus exclusively on one moment, or on one particular case study, would be, it seems to me, and I think also to us, given the talks we've heard over the last 2 days, to miss the point. The emergence of a predominantly secular worldview and its interaction with the emergence of modern scholarly disciplines has constituted a process, not a punctum. Obvious milestones, such as Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species or Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God notwithstanding, it would surely be misleading to pinpoint any single decisive turning point in the development of secularity. Like the grains of sand in the Sorites paradox, it's difficult, I think, to say at what point the seeds of secularity became an established tree. Instead of attempting to capture then a dramatic moment of conversion, what I propose today is to trace, however fleetingly, the emergence of a tradition. Gabi's forbearance, and with your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to explore the extent to which the rise of secularity drove the emergence not only of specific scholarly disciplines, but also that of the underlying concept of humanistic critique. In the context of a symposium dedicated to the relationship between the interaction of religion and secular culture on the one hand, and the development of the humanities and sciences on the other, and in homage to Gabi's research interests, I propose to focus my attention on that great cradle of modern scholarship, German high culture. Tracing a number of moments in the development of the German tradition of what one might loosely term Kulturkritik, I will suggest that the salient characteristic of this tradition can be summarized as what I term late reading. You have the title up there. In contrast to, say, the categories of close or distant reading, late reading, as I conceptualize it, positions the interpreter consciously at the end of a tradition or culture, deriving meaning precisely from this position. The pathos of late style is thereby applied to the ethos of modernity. If modern literature can be understood, as I've argued in my most recent book, Lateness and Modern European Literature, as effectively one sustained period of late style, then modern criticism can be understood, I will try to suggest today, as something like a hermeneutics of lateness. Such a hermeneutics derives much of its power from the enduring tension between religion and secularity. It must be understood, that is to say, in the context of debates regarding secularization of theological models of history. Reinhard Koselleck's much-discussed notion of a Sattelzeit, or transitional saddle period, around the beginning of the 19th century, suggests that modernity as we know it emerged in the wake not only of the industrial French revolutions, but also that of Romanticism, with its subjective turn, preference for organic metaphors of growth and decay. Traditionally, theological categories were increasingly repurposed as idealist transcendental categories, which is to say, of course, as essentially Protestant pietist categories in this context, and by no one more obviously than by Kant. Kant's late essay, Das Ende aller Dinge, the end of all things, 1794, conceives the idea of a final ending or day of judgment as a moral category. It cannot, he argues, be a conceptual one, given the impossibility for time-bound humans to imagine the end of time. Eschatology, for Kant, serves the purpose, inasmuch as it provides what he calls, in the key term of his essay, an Endzweck. And he thereby conflates, I think, the two senses of end, arguing that the motif of the Last Judgment forms both finis and telos, both endpoint and goal of history. That this amounts to a reworking of his moral philosophy, and in particular of the celebrated idea of the kingdom of ends, is not the least of its ironies. Rather than enjoining us to treat our fellow humans as ends and not means, he identifies eschatology as the means to an end. For all Kant's impatience with the conceptual paradoxes of eschatology, his essay illustrates the continuing importance of theological categories in an increasingly historicist age. Biblical criticism that would play such an important role in the development of 19th century scholarship, Schleiermacher's hermeneutics to Lachmann's philology, increasingly takes on this historicist flavour, from the so-called Fragmentenstreit in the 1770s to David Friedrich Strauss's Das Leben Jesu in the 1830s, Christ's life begins to be historicised and eschatologically determined, in the words of Jakob Taubes. This period of the 1830s can be characterised, borrowing the title of Karl Immermann's novel of 1836, as epigonal. It is dominated in intellectual terms by the legacy of idealism, and above all by that of Hegel, who had died at the start of the decade in 1831. Hegel's, as we know, is an essentially teleological view of history. The world spirit unfolds inexorably as time passes, a world spirit that seems to have culminated, to paraphrase Nietzsche's famous jibe, in Hegel's apartment in Berlin. Indeed, Hegel's view of history is nothing if not Eurocentric, beginning in the East and concluding in the West. Europe, he states in his lectures on the philosophy of history, is plainly the goal of history. As Karl Löwith would note, for Hegel, the Orientals were the childhood of the world, the Greeks and Romans its youth and manhood, and the Christian peoples are its maturity. There is another way of understanding maturity, however, and it is here that we can take our cue. In chapter 3 of his lectures, Hegel introduces the resonant idea of the Greisenalter des Geistes. I'll read the German out, but you've got the English too. Das natürliche Greisenalter ist schwächer. Das Greisenalter des Geistes aber ist eine vollkommene Reife, in welche zurückgeht zur Einheit, aber als Geist. So where old age of the body, old age of nature, amounts to decline and decay, old age of the mind, or indeed of spirit, can be more positively understood as maturity and self-consciousness. I think it's interesting to apply two terms we tend to use for late style to this statement. Firstly, I say we tend to use these terms, but actually the thing is, in German, these terms are used much more than in English, and this is one of the problems of the whole discourse of late style as it's developed. In English, the term late style is generally used by itself to mean both old age style and late style, both alter Stil and Spätstil. And this is one of the big problems, I think, of the discourse of late style as it's developed in the English-speaking world. Those two things have been, by and large, conflated and not kept apart. In the German tradition, these two terms, I think, are used, or have been used more by critics. And if we keep the two terms apart, then we could say that we have, on the one hand, alter Stil, old age style, das natürliche Greisenalter, the old age of nature, and on the other hand, what one might call then late style, Spätstil, in a more positive sense, the old age of spirit. So we'll have a biological sense of decline, as essentially a negative category, and as it were, a recuperative, positive category of late style at the end, das Greisenalter des Geistes. Purpose is a positive thing. So this Greisenalter des Geistes begins, according to Hegel, with the advent of Christianity. I think this emphasizes the extent to which the teleological model underlying his philosophy of history transforms what Francis Bacon calls the old age of the world into the culmination of the world. Modernity for Hegel is maturity. At this point, one might, of course, consider Hegel's much-discussed thesis of the end of art, the ways in which it points beyond itself to the philosophy of art. But in order to stay focused on the interaction between religious and secular modes of critique, I'll turn rather to Hegel's contested legacy and to what is surely a central document for the topic of this conference. In 1841, Feuerbach had put forward his anthropological conception of religion in the essence of Christianity. The aim of his approach, he subsequently explained, was to derive from the philosophy of the absolute, that is theology, the necessity for a philosophy of man, that is anthropology, to base the criticism of the philosophy of man on criticism of the philosophy of God. This post-Hegelian conception of absolute religion as the basis for profane critique was taken up around the same time by none other than Marx, whose introduction to critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, 1843-4, contains perhaps the best known of all statements about the cultural status of religion, namely that it is the opium of the masses. It begins, however, with an equally startling statement. For Germany, the critique of religion has been essentially completed. The critique of religion is the essential precondition for all criticism. Here, then, is the point at which modern scholarship is to pick up, and indeed Marx promptly instructs us as to how the obsolete field of theology finds itself dispatched across the disciplines. Thus, the critique of heaven is transformed into a critique of earth, the critique of religion into the critique of law, and the critique of theology into the critique of politics. For a country as obsessed with philosophy and theory as the Germans, so Marx's argument, even emancipation from religion is determined by religion, a negation of theology, which is itself a theology. That's Feuerbach's attack on Hegel. The scholarly disciplines are thus conceived as the continuation of theology by other means. Secularity can only be thought as a move beyond religion, not as its absence. By the end of the 19th century, of course, the death of God has become headline news. If Hegel anticipates this death but transforms it dialectically into absolute consciousness, and if Bruno Bauer, schooled in Feuerbach, develops this into the more specific claim that God is dead for philosophy, Nietzsche is openly hostile to history understood as disguised theology. Hegel's confidence in the maturity of modernity can be set, that is to say, against Nietzsche's excoriation of its lateness. For Nietzsche, modernity is not mature but decadent, and this decadence, crucially, amounts to the decadence of Christianity. The need for redemption, the embodiment of all Christian needs, writes Nietzsche in 1888, is the most honest expression of decadence. Yet, Nietzsche's response to this religious model of decadence is not to reject it per se, but to embrace a strong, because knowing, version of it. I'm just as much a child of my age, he writes, which is to say a decadent. It's just that I've understood this, I've resisted it. The great denouncer of modern decadence thus seeks to overcome the putative lateness of history by confronting it. Nothing is more modern, he concludes, this total sickness, this lateness and overexcitement of the neurological mechanism. Nietzsche condemns modernity as decadent in his work of the 1880s. In his earlier work of the 1870s, he condemns it as epigonal. Most famously, in his Untimely Meditations, Nietzsche develops a sustained critique of what he perceives as the epigonentum of modern culture. Having dismissed David Strauss as a Bildungsphilister, or cultural philistine, defined as someone who transforms every science which might be expected to disturb his complacency into an historical discipline, he proceeds to explore, on the uses and disadvantages of history for life, ways in which modern man struggles under the great and ever greater pressure or last of what is past. Famously outlining three main methodologies with which to engage with this past, the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical, Nietzsche denounces the first two as merely perpetuating the whole noisy sham culture of our age. The very term, Afterbildung, locates modernity in the realm of the after. Only the critical model, which amounts to forgetting the past, can mitigate the belief that one is a latecomer and epigon. Those words. At this point, Nietzsche reserves his most withering criticism for the Hegelian teleological argument that lateness equates to maturity. The belief that one is a latecomer of the age is, in any case, paralyzing and depressing. It must appear dreadful and devastating when such a belief one day, by a bold inversion, raises the latecomer to godhood as the true meaning and goal of all previous events, and his miserable condition is equated with the completion of world history. For Nietzsche, then, to understand history and its attendant disciplines of philosophy and philology as a disguised theology is to mistake historical lateness for cultural progress, not so much Pascal's wager as progress's wager. It is a bet he declines to take. Nietzsche's criticism of 19th century scholarship stands out particularly acutely if we set it against his views on aesthetics. Strikingly, here the terms of his argument are almost exactly reversed. Where modern critics are dismissed as epigons, modern artists and poets depend on their late perspective. This too is Nietzsche. Poets have to be, in many respects, creatures looking backwards, rückwärtsgewendete Wesen, so that they can be employed as bridges to quite distant ages and conceptions, to dead or dying religions and cultures. They are, in fact, always and necessarily epigons. If, then, we are fully to understand Nietzsche's version of late reading, it must be in this more nuanced sense, as someone who both condemns and cultivates modernity's sense of lateness. The two epistemologies arguably correspond to Nietzsche's dual self-conception as both philosopher and artist. Where the philosopher dismisses epigonentum as an unproductive historical position, the artist acknowledges its productive capacities as a cultural category. As a critic, however, Nietzsche remains overwhelmingly dismissive of modern lateness, defining contemporary culture through its belated status, which is to say, in his terms, through its continuing dependency on a derivative Christian model of culture. For Nietzsche, modern, supposedly secular scholarship is hamstrung by the legacy of Christianity, leaving it incapable of defining itself on its own terms. As he writes, we moderns have nothing whatever of our own. Well, it's between these two extremes, it seems to me, that one can stake out a continuum of responses to the relationship between secularity and the disciplines within this modern German tradition. What one might term the Hegelian perspective, Christian modernity is the summit of history, finds its negative counterpart in what one might term the Nietzschean perspective, Christian modernity as the senescence of history. Pathos gives way to bathos. To some extent, this development reflects, of course, the rapid spread of secularity over the course of the 19th century, by the end of which disciplinary presuppositions regarding transcendental truths had all but disappeared. It is also, however, a function of the growing realization that the great secular God that was meant to replace the transcendental God, namely progress, was itself an idol with feet of clay. The question as to whether the modern notion of progress should be considered a secularized version of Judeo-Christian eschatology haunts much of modern German thought, but it is perhaps most explicitly addressed in the debate between Karl Löwith and Hans Blumenberg. In his Meaning in History, published in German in 1949, Löwith argued that modern secular philosophies of history derive directly from the Christian conception of history as an interregnum between the death of Christ and the Second Coming, examining in particular the hidden dependence of the secular religion of progress on the Christian faith, hope, and expectation of progressing toward a final fulfillment of history by judgment and salvation. That's not the one you have, I'll get to that. Löwith suggests that the post-Enlightenment orthodoxy of a teleological, ever-improving world constitutes little more than messianism in disguise. Modernity, in other words, can only be justified by recourse to an externally determined eschatology, a historiographical deus ex machina. He writes here, the significance of this vision of an ultimate end as both finis and telos is that it provides a scheme of progressive order and meaning. Not only does the eschaton delimit the process of history by an end, it also articulates and fulfills it by a definite goal. In direct response to Löwith's thesis, as well as to Carl Schmitt's so-called political theology, Hans Blumenberg wrote The Legitimacy of the Modern Age, arguing that modernity has no need for transcendental justification since progress develops through an imminent process of self-determination. Well, the example of the Löwith-Blumenberg debate shows the extent to which the so-called crisis of culture that characterizes much German thought in the early 20th century is predicated on the contested legacy of theological modes of critique, from Weber's disenchantment to Rosenzweig's attempts at redemption, from Spengler's denunciation of decline to Hermann Brock's attempts to establish the ethics of old age style. The secularizing tendency of modernity is not only diagnosed, but it is also disputed. Underlying these differing modes of Geschichtsphilosophie is a sense of modernity not as a manifestation of so many forms of the new, but as an engagement with modes of lateness. Whether understood as completion, finis, or goal, telos, secular modernity is defined by its belated status vis-à-vis its religious past. As such, one might say that German cultural criticism, conceptualized as a school of late reading, amounts to the hermeneutic equivalent to the aesthetic notion of late style. And the key point here is that late style is itself not a naive creative category, but is rather a discursive critical construct, developed largely by post-romantic criticism as a way of demarcating either the supreme achievements of Western art, late style as great style, or a sense of anticlimax, a minor coda to a major body of work. I might perhaps summarize this as noted earlier through the distinction between Spätstil and Alterstil. Indeed, this polarization is in many ways the defining characteristic of late style as it has traditionally been understood. As the editors of one recent volume called Late Style and Its Discontents note, late style is generally characterized in one of two modes, either as serene, synthetic, and consummatory, or as irascible, discordant, and recalcitrant. In one of the most substantial recent studies of the notion of late work, Sandro Zanetti confirmed the diagnosis, phrasing the opposition in terms of accumulation versus reduction, or borrowing the rhetorical terms of Quintilian, adjectio versus detractio, and viewing Goethe as the paradigm of the former and Hölderlin as the paradigm of the latter. These basic binary modes can be broken down in turn into a series of further binaries, including caesura versus continuity, senescence versus rejuvenation, madness, lucidity, revision, innovation, fragmentation, unification, completion, supplement. What such binaries amount to, in fact, is a modern variation on the age-old distinction codified as early as Aristotle's rhetoric between pathos and ethos. I would also add a third model to the mix, however. Alongside pathos and ethos, which Longinus, writing about Homer in On the Sublime, terms the chief characteristic of old-age style, it seems to me that one might also consider bathos as a form of lateness. Now, I want to suggest today that these opposing forms of late style can also be applied to what I term late reading. From Hegel to Nietzsche, from Löwith to Blumenberg, my three musketeers of modernity, pathos, ethos, and bathos, resonate throughout the German intellectual tradition, creating a space in which the relationship between vestigial Christianity and emergent secularity becomes the stake and indeed the subtext of cultural criticism. If this sense of lateness is the battleground on which modernity is contested, it is precisely because it is susceptible to competing claims. Lateness, I've concluded, after several years studying and theorizing the concept, is like a Rorschach test. The observer sees what he or she wants to see in the inkblot. This pliability certainly applies to the theological legacy that informs the tradition of late reading. Different critics interpret it in different ways. It's also, however, a political, or perhaps one should say, politico-theological category. But lateness can be a right-wing or left-wing concept. It can be culturally conservative or aesthetically progressive. While Spengler takes Nietzsche's diagnosis of the decline or Untergang of modernity to its conservative extreme, arguing explicitly that Western modernity is at the end of the late period, a more progressive form of late reading emerges with the advent of modernism. Driven by the events of the 1930s to see himself as the last European, Walter Benjamin, about whom we've already heard today, seeks to make a hermeneutic virtue out of historical necessity, advocating in his celebrated theses on the philosophy of history a model of redemptive criticism, rettende Kritik, predicated on a vertiginously late epistemology. These are Benjamin's words. In relation to the history of organic life on Earth, writes a modern biologist, the paltry 50 millennia of Homo sapiens constitute something like 2 seconds at the close of the 24-hour day. On this scale, the history of civilized mankind would fill 1/5 of the last second of the last hour. The present, which as a model of messianic time comprises the entire history of mankind in an enormous abridgment, coincides exactly with the stature which the history of mankind has in the universe. What is so striking about this statement is not merely the articulation of mankind's position, and a fortiori that of modern civilized man at the very end of history, but also the quintessentially Benjaminian conceptualization of this position as messianic time. If the present, which is to say modernity, is defined as the very last moment in the history of organic life, it is by the same token expressive of the entire history of mankind, inasmuch as it compresses, through his famous concept of the Jetztzeit, the now time, all human time. Benjamin compresses, that is to say, biology, history, and theology in order to suggest that precisely because modernity is late, it can assume, at least potentially, the power of redemption. In effect, then, Benjamin's particular contribution to the tradition of Marxist historiography is to re-enchant it. The disenchanted world of Weberian modernity is reinvested with the pathos of a constantly deferred messianism. The later history becomes, the closer it will be to messianic redemption. Benjamin's late attempt to secularize the notion of redemptive criticism thus offers a hermeneutic variation on Löwith's historiographical model. Ultimate meaning is deferred to the last second of the last hour. It is only at the end, at the notional moment of messianic revelation, that the work of art reveals its full potential. Enos and telos are reconciled. Criticism thus represents the belated completion of the work of art, not its Endung, but its Vollendung. It is no accident, of course, such a model of interpretation places a great responsibility on the critic. Late reading, in the Benjaminian sense, is designed precisely, I think, to foreground the role of the critic, to make him the belated counterpart to the earlier artist. Following Schelling and the German Romantics, Benjamin, and I think not without self-interest, interprets the task of the critic as bringing to full disclosure the inherent potentialities of the work of art. More pointedly, the critic locates himself, herself, towards the messianic end of history, the greater the pathos, in short. Benjamin is alert, however, to the danger of this historiographical model of interpretation. The undifferentiated accumulation of knowledge does not in itself guarantee privileged insight. The later perspective is not necessarily superior to the earlier one, since it may lack that destructive moment that ensures the authenticity of dialectical thought. His words. Pathos, in short, may drift into bathos. In his essay on Edward Fuchs, Benjamin warns that cultural history understood in a purely sequential manner in fact risks impeding rather than enabling genuine insight, since it increases the burden of the treasures on the back of mankind, but it does not give mankind necessarily strength to shake these off. If this burden of history seems to anticipate the storm of progress of the ninth thesis, Benjamin's theses, it also echoes the Nietzschean language of lateness, the great and ever greater burden of what is past. And this can only be relieved, according to Nietzsche, by the process of forgetting, the third critical model of historiography. Benjamin, in short, late reading is dialectical reading, combining both an accumulative and a destructive moment. Another way of putting this, and in more ideologically charged terms, is to suggest that Benjamin's aesthetics are in fact as conservative as they are progressive. This may seem a surprising claim to make about a thinker indelibly associated with the Marxist debates of the interwar years. As his friend Gershom Scholem noted, however, Benjamin himself was keenly aware of what he called the strange interplay between reactionary theory and revolutionary practice. Subsequent critics of the caliber of Jürgen Habermas concluded that Benjamin's thought is best described as a conservative reactionary hermeneutic. To be sure, this verdict must be understood within the context of a generation for which left and right-wing epistemologies, in theoretical terms, were often blurred. Contemporary preoccupations such as the philosophy of history, the critique of progress, the perceived decadence of modern culture, progressive, conservative positions were at times oddly similar. The Weberian disenchantment of modernity found its counterpart in the Spenglerian decline of the West. The distinctly Benjaminian move, however, was to re-enchant modernity, to sketch out through his philosophy of constellations, images, and now-time, a resurgence of mythological forces in modern garb. The premise of his redemptive criticism, in other words, is that capitalist modernity is culturally late, but that it is for this reason that it contains the seeds of its own salvation, since it functions as the secret index to which the past is referred to redemption. This attempt to imagine history from a messianic perspective would become a recurring theme of 20th century German thought, from Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption via Benjamin's theses to Adorno's philosophy from the standpoint of redemption. For Adorno in particular, lateness emerges as the prerequisite for progressive aesthetics. From his early essay on Beethoven's late style onwards, lateness was a lifelong preoccupation for Adorno. By the time of the post-war period, it comes to assume a quasi-transcendental status, one might term a late sublime, as exemplified by a letter of 1951 to Thomas Mann. Adorno writes, "The boldness and modernity of these things," he's talking about Mann's late novel, De Welt. "The boldness and modernity of these things is, if we accept Joyce, quite unparalleled, but no less striking is the careful way in which you have managed to suspend the whole German element. It often sounds as though, at a certain decayed level of language, at the level of emigrant German, you had somehow disclosed the latent possibility of a truly European language, one which was formerly obstructed by national divisions, but now, at the end, shines forth as a primordial stratum precisely by virtue of its latest character." Wonderful passage, very telling of its time. Already for Adorno, a term of aesthetic praise, that is to say, lateness, literally here, becomes its own superlative, Kraft des Spätesten. Modernism, represented here by Mann and Joyce, is now not to be understood as the late, but as the latest, as a category that collapses divisions both geographically, as a European meta-language, and historically, as an Urschicht, now finally uncovered at the end. If this thus amounts to aesthetics from the standpoint of redemption, it is also criticism from the standpoint of completion. What Adorno is sketching out, in short, is a transcendental basis for the discipline of comparative literature, a discipline that we know is just taking off at this post-war point. A theologically grounded understanding of lateness becomes the prerequisite for a new European, broad, comparative discipline that transcends national divisions. The post-war specificity of this development, of this standpoint, can be illustrated by my final exemplar of late reading, Erich Auerbach. As Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht has noted, the celebrated generation of German Romanisten of the mid-20th century all died in the 1940s and 1950s with the feeling, more or less pronounced, more or less lamented, that their lifetime had seen the end of the great period of Western culture. In his important essay of 1952, The Philology of World Literature, Auerbach argues that we appear to be living at a decisive moment in the evolution of hermeneutical history writing. Auerbach's precise understanding of his historical position and of the concomitant task of the philologists of the world, his terms, emerges out of the interplay between his terminology and his sources. In the original German, his word for decisive moment is simply Kairos. Wir leben in einem Kairos der verstehenden Geschichtsschreibung. The Pauline term signifying sacred time of revelation, understood as a pivotal, punctual instant, in contrast to the chronos of everyday unfulfilled time. The term was notably brought into modern conceptual currency by Paul Tillich in 1922 and by Hermann Fraenkel in 1931. In Auerbach's work, it occurs in his investigations of Dante and the trope of figura and the notion of fulfillment in mimesis. Around the same time as Auerbach's post-war essay on philology, Jakob Taubers employs the term in his Abendländische Eschatologie, 1947, to indicate a fulfilled lateness that returns to its origins. He writes, Endzeit und Urzeit kreuzen sich im Kairos. So end times and original times meet each other in Kairos. Within English language criticism, perhaps Frank Kermode's The Sense of an Ending provides the most influential invocation of Kairos, defining it as charged with a meaning derived from its relation to the end. Kermode's words. Even this brief survey of the term suggests then that Auerbach's decisive moment in the history of hermeneutics echoes with eschatology, at a seminal moment in the development of post-war culture, and more specifically in the development of the post-war discipline of comparative literature, being at the end of Western culture once more emerges as a powerful rhetorical trope, an island of transcendence within a sea of secularity. Well, what my brief survey of examples from thinkers as disparate as Hegel, Nietzsche, Spengler, Benjamin, Adorno, and Auerbach suggests, I think, is that German cultural criticism of the 19th and 20th centuries can usefully be understood as constituting a tradition of late reading. These, and a number of other thinkers, of course, take differing positions within this tradition. I'm certainly not trying to impose any single epistemology upon such a varied range of theorists. One possible line of distinction, for instance, would be to distinguish between Christian and Jewish modes of lateness. More generally, I want to suggest that late reading as a mode of criticism constitutes a range of responses to a common question, namely, how to understand culture in a secular age. To summarize, the concept of late style can be understood as a means of policing the artistic canon. The concept of late reading can be understood as a means of policing modernity. Late reading, as I understand it, seeks to come to terms with the increasingly secular nature of modern culture, while at the same time resisting it, moving beyond the Christian worldview, Judeo-Christian worldview, while simultaneously smuggling a teleological, quasi-messianic force back into criticism through the back door. While this double movement can be discerned, I think, everywhere in modern thought, disenchantment seems to desiderate re-enchantment, it is particularly apparent, I would argue, within German culture, with its porous interface between religion and secular culture, its enduring Jewish inflections, and its strong tradition of science and scholarship. It is also, one might note, vestigially Hegelian, a kind of Aufhebung of theology into the humanistic disciplines, both destroys and preserves its characteristics. That this tradition is itself arguably predicated on understanding Germany as what Helmut Plessner would term the belated nation, thus above all as a cultural nation, is not the least of the ways in which late reading may offer a helpful prism through which to view the shifting relationship between secularity and modern critical thought. For to conceive of cultural criticism and its attendant disciplines in these terms is, in the last analysis, to inquire into their metaphysical underpinnings. Ending, as Kant already knew, is ultimately a theological category. The final paradox, as German intellectual history shows us, is that there is no ending to thinking about ending. But perhaps this is ultimately not inappropriate. In the words of one of the greatest of modern thinkers, namely Woody Allen, eternity is a long time, especially at the end. Perhaps the same thing, ironically, may also be said of secularity. Thank you very much.
It was indeed with a great pleasure and interest I read the excellent essay you just heard by Ben Hutchinson. A well-done paper indeed, dedicated as homage to Gabriel Motzkin and his work. Also as a belated remark concerning secularity and its disciplines of knowledge. What Ben dealt with in his paper is the way in which critique, understood here mainly as a cultural critic or Kulturkritik, is associated with the project of secularism. That is, in what ways and how the modern disciplines of knowledge and of critique themselves, disciplines like philology, modern hermeneutics, philosophy and history, at least in the German intellectual frameworks from Kant and Hegel to Benjamin and Auerbach, engaged the question of modernity and the project of secularism, its possibilities and failures, as a moment of self-reflection. A belated one, yet dialectic enough, revealing its own theological foundations. In other words, what Ben is looking at is how the German disciplines of Kulturkritik were founded as a self-critical disciplines of the secular project, arguing for, but also and always against its old possibilities, revealing time and again the theological aspect of its own historical work. What Benjamin calls a late reading is thus a mode of thinking, a self-critical one, based, however, on a concept of time, which is both historical and messianic. For what a late reading engaged is both a reflection, a dialectic perspective, a viewpoint of history as a progress, but also as a decline, a downfall of man. And both movements are understood as a move towards an end. So even the no ending is an end. This, however, the end of history itself cannot be understood. This is a crucial moment in Ben's text, I think, but rather in terms of eschatological time, namely in the terms of the Messiah. What is being funded in as secular, the disciplines of Kulturkritik, are thus based on certain metaphysical assumptions in plural, understood as transformation, translation, radicalization, realization of theological terms of time and of space. At least in the German context, the late reading is thus the moment in which the secular itself turns via self-reflection, again, into a radical performance of the Messiah. This is what the term of ending, das Ende, in Hebrew, Achrit Hayamim, says in Kant and Hegel, but also in Benjamin and Rosenzweig, and in Auerbach's reflection on literature. For what allegory implies in Benjamin's writing and what figura means in Auerbach's seminal work is this transformation of messianic time into modernist textures of critique. History, philology, literature, art critic, the modern disciplines of knowledge, we suppose as secular faculties, the major faculties of the humanistic tradition and of our universities, being emerged from the critique of religion and from the critique of scriptures, as Ben reminds us, they were and still are of theological depth. They were founded in association with certain Christian traditions regarding the end of time. This, however, the leftovers of God, the time that is left for us in the Christian view, the time until the second coming, is not only a non-secular materia, that which is not to be secularized, but rather it is what we call the secular condition itself. Ben's paper is thus written and delivered as a generous and faithful gesture to this German intellectual tradition, a tradition of belated thinkers, Germans and Jews who engage secularism in modes of self-reflection as attempts of self-criticism, and this, we argue, was always dialectic enough, namely offering integrative, comprehensive modes of thinking and of writing. We, or at least most of us, stand in different terms of belonging, but also as strangers among and between this great tradition, German tradition. Our own projects, one could argue, are derivations of German idealism. Once we return, however, to reflect our positions in and against it, again in a way of being too late, we should refer also to its failures, its shortage, its false assumption, its wrong applications. The protagonist in this ideal drama, or drama of ideas, is of course Goethe's Faust, or better, King Lear, right? The oldest of all, the last one, who, however, is also the first one, right? This is the paradox of time in modernity and in humanism. We are always here, coming too late, but perhaps not the latest one, and always too early. This is also, right, Nietzsche. What has been forgotten, however, in this tradition, being too late, being too early, once it is being reconstructed as such, as an intellectual framework, as a great history or drama of ideas, with Faust or King Lear at its end, at the last stage of it, or as a metaphysical project, demand also a different modes of critical engagement. What is being left as a trace, perhaps, hint in Ben's paper, demands certain radicalization, a break, interruption, a split out. This is to be named, perhaps proper. Our engagement demands today an attention to the forgotten bodies of this tradition, the creature, the other gender, the woman, the Jew. What this German intellectual tradition, again, in its reconstructed version as such, fails time and again to deal with, in engaging the secular tradition, was the creaturely states of man existence, the body, the being of the animal. What is left undone in terms of thinking in this tradition is the sexual difference, rethinking, reflecting the world via the other sex, the woman. What is being forgotten, untouched in the reconstruction of this tradition, mainly in dealing with the German Jewish contribution, Rosenzweig, Buber, Scholem, Benjamin, Auerbach, is the resistance of the Orient, the impression and the return of Hebrew in Yiddish, bodies of knowledge, such as the Talmud Midrash and the Hasidic tale. What is often being left in silence once we return to deal with this tradition in the associations of Judaism and Islam, beyond or within the Christian framework, so yet within but without. Rosenzweig's translation of the Andalusian liturgical poetry is an example of such a project, attempting after the First World War in breaking the metaphysical frames of German intellectual history and its legacy by a move into the world of liturgical poem, itself a leftover of a certain Judeo-Arabic tradition. The engagement with those still hidden, forgotten bodies of German intellectual tradition, again, the creature, the female, the Jew, thus demands a theoretical turn, also avoiding the metaphysical framework as such. Is this possible? And how? Those questions are difficult and carry heavy weight, right? It's just when we heard Menninghaus telling us and repeating, right, this line, this pure verse, right, east or west, home is the best. How difficult this line to be repeated here and today, right? It will blow all machines, so to say, right? It cannot. It is of no measure. Thinking of the binding and the gaps, right, of east and west, and the question, heavy of all, home. Right. So the questions are difficult and carry heavy weight, and it's partly the wave of the tradition then reconstructs so nicely today. So what we argue, following this great scheme of thought introduced in Ben's paper, is that dealing with the question of secularism calls for concrete method of reading, method of listening, hinting also at bodies, names, voices, being incorrupted in the German intellectual history, in Western thought as such. We are invited to recall the body language and the voices of laughter, the jokes being heard in Immanuel Kant's Kritik der Urteilskraft. A return of the secular condition calls for reading Kant with Heinrich von Kleist, reading Hegel on the philosophy of right with Grimm's fairy tales. And once we came with the Grimm fairy tales, it's gone on, right? reading Goethe's Faust with Büchner, Kant und Stott, reading Walter Benjamin with and against Talmud, or Eric Auerbach on the binding of Isaac in the first chapter of his book Mimesis, alongside the Hebrew Aramaic Midrash on the Akedah. Or better, reading again is Figura with and against the great chapters on Rabelais and Boccaccio, the chapters on the creaturely bodies and the ethics of love in Nemesis. And reading finally Martin Heidegger with Celan, reading of Mauscheln, yet primarily reading Heidegger with and after Ingvar Bachmann, Malina. So the question of the other sex. The belated reading, reflecting secularity and its critical disciplines, demands inversions, collapses, detours, interruptions, permanent ones, revealing what we call the missing bodies of German idealism. Ben's excellent introduction of major trends in the German intellectual history, gathering significant figures of thought in the European project of modernity, recalls thus in response, so in correspondence, in Gegenwart, its creature. It is the world of creation itself, the being of creature on earth, that emerges also in a prayer, a fallen angel, a man or a dog, beloved or forgotten. What we call secularity depends our attention to those bodies who are left on earth, on soil, in the dirt of being. Without conclusion, for as Ben asked us to agree, and we agree, the secular question is to be left of no ending. I wish, however, with your permission, to add now one word of gratitude on this tune to Gabriel Motzkin. Professor Motzkin was a reader, a very generous reader indeed, a reviewer of my dissertation on Immanuel Kant and the German ideas of play and irony. I met him later a few times during his service as a dean at the Faculty of the Humanities of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. At that time, I was appointed as a lecturer at the German department. On one occasion, I asked Gabi for his advice regarding his view on German studies and its future. Gabi answered me very well, yet not without certain ambiguities and ironies you all know. He also told me anecdote of his own. The decision I made after this was based perhaps on misinterpretation of his tale, which I don't repeat today. For there is perhaps no lesson, no moral to this beside the gift, the greatest of all, perhaps, a young man may ask for himself, a blessing for a travel. Thank you very much.
All right, I have 3 remarks to this extraordinarily stimulating presentation, and they're going to be lay remarks, but I think it's important, like, we dealt a lot, not just with late culture, but with the sense of an ending, or with the end. Now, you have 2 different senses of an end. You can have the end as telos. You can have the end without telos, you know. I can be 89 years old and think I'm probably going to die at some point, and not because I think there's a great triumph or a sudden ending or anything, just one more purposeless existence coming to an end. And I think that one of the interesting things would be to see when end and telos are confused. It's very nice. And when, in fact, they're separated. That's one point. Now, the second point is this. Let's suppose you live after the ending. There's a big debate between Heidegger and Junger. All kinds of people have debated this. You know what happens? You wake up after the Second World War. It's all over the countries. And you're living after the end. Now, the real question there is, can you remember historical period? Because you can have 2 senses of the post-life. One is, I was never here, at one extreme, and the other is the Hegelian thing. Preserve every moment in the past in an act of full self-consciousness, so you're seeing the whole past as a static tableau. And, of course, we do some of both, but it's an interesting question, because in history, what happens is that we're constantly assigning the past to an irrelevant period. For instance, Germans, after World War II, view everything that happened before the Stunde Null as happening to somebody else. For Israelis, view the mandatory period, that's when the British were here, you know, the mandatory period as a period that belongs to prehistory, because history obviously begins on the 14th of May. So it's a sort of interesting question to think about, what do you do with a memory, with a historical memory of a phase that is that you choose to regard no longer as so relevant. In other words, and what it means to remember the past. Because again, you know, we would like to think that we have souls and that after our death I'll remember all the events of my life. I don't know what emotional attitude I'll have to all this. But on the other hand, we also really believe and have internalized from secular culture the idea that once we die, it's as if we never were. Our existence, you know, it's as if, not as if we were, as if we never were. We never existed. Now that leads me to my third point, which is, I know this argument from Löwith that, you know, secularization, secular culture, it's all a transfer from religious culture. And the answer is, I think, yes and no. Because certainly the philosophy of history cannot be understood except as a transformation of Christian categories into the philosophy of history, and I think that's really clear. Joachim Fiore, you can go on and on. However, that's not true of what really happened in the disciplines. The beginning of experimental psychology with Wundt, or the analytic philosophy with Carnap and Reichenbach, cannot be understood in any picture as a continuity of some religious categories of what were before. And the question that would be interesting to research is the transition from one to the other. In other words, if you look at the period, for instance, when analytic, and I'm just going to go into my field for one second, when analytic and continental philosophy had not yet split up, and you ask yourself about Meinung and what happens in Austrian philosophy at that period, the generation before logical positivism, you see that there's an uneasy existence or diarchy between both kinds of currents. So it's a big question. You know, I was trying to think in my mind, of course, it's in a different Catholic culture, but I was trying to think, what are the religious moments even in Durkheim? And I don't mean in his content, the elementary forms of the religious life. What would be more religious? But can categories be reduced to religious categories? I think it's a big question. Germans like to think this way, especially Protestant Germans. And I think it's true for certain fields. I just don't believe it's true for all fields. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gabby, for those three questions. I think if I can be somewhat disingenuous, I'll try to answer them all in one go, which is to say that I think what we're really talking about is that this category of lateness and late reading, it's really a way of assigning meaning. It's about the assignment of meaning, which is to say it's about the creation of meaning. It's about the creation of pathos. This is what I've been trying to show. Now, what that means is one has to understand that as historically, culturally contingent, and this is one of the lessons one has to draw from the whole discourse of late style, particularly as it's developed in the last 10 or 15 years. There's always traditionally been this tendency to try to create, as it were, a universal, transcendental notion of late style, somehow to be able to extract the essence of late style or lateness more broadly and apply it universally, irrespective of historical cultural conditions and times and so on. Now, what's become very clear, and this is the big lesson really of the last 10 or 15 years in the discourse of late style, is that that's not possible and that it's very much a contingent category, which is to say, it's very much a category that is created, as it were, ex post facto by critics largely, not by what one might call practitioners, not by artists and writers who think of themselves as having a late period, a late style. That's not to say that some don't think of themselves in those terms or aren't encouraged to do so, but that the category such as we have it is essentially a critical construct. Now, why, if we come to that realization, which is very interesting, we then ask, well, why has that been the case? Why has it emerged in those terms? And I think that the reason for that is largely that, as I very briefly said, late style has traditionally been understood as great style. That's the shorthand I use, which is to say, creating this category of late style as a way of essentially creating a canon. It's a way of policing a canon. It's a way of saying certain people, certain universal exemplars of Western tradition are assigned a late style. You could take 4 or 5 examples from the history of Western culture, Goethe, Rembrandt, etc., Shakespeare. And what the realization you come to is that these are the major dead white male figures of the canon. In other words, it's a way of creating a teleological model of the canon and saying that these are the people who deserve to be recognized as having a late style because they have succeeded in attaining this ultimate achievement, which is having a late style. It's seen in those teleological terms. So now if you then transfer that, as I've been trying to show, do something further with that and transfer that realization, that discourse to modernity, into our discussions of modernity, whether in the discipline of history or elsewhere, then you actually see that something similar happens. And this is where, I left this out of this talk, but I would actually be quite critical of much of this tradition, and I sense some of this in your response. That what this is about is also a way of defending a canon. It's a way of defending a particular carefully demarcated body of Western art, European art, very broadly. So when you touched on the role of women, creaturely, the absence of women, sexual difference, you touched on Eastern as well as Western models. The whole point is, and this is why I'd be very critical of this tradition in a way, the whole point of this tradition is it's a way of creating it's a way of heightening the pathos of the Western tradition. I mean, there's the castle of a castle has no greater meaning than when it's embattled. has no greater significance and urgency than when it's embattled. And the castle of Western culture, in that sense, if you create the sense of it as being embattled or as being at its end, I mean, this is a crisis of humanism, then of course what you're doing in doing that is you're also creating a great sense of pathos, urgency, and meaning for it. So this is a way of saying that, particularly your second question about being after you became sort of metaphysical, talked about your soul, I think, and you were saying after our death, what might we look, as it were, theoretically look back on? And that, of course, is a slightly, I mean, what one has to say is that's a different sense of lateness. I mean, in English we use, this is interesting, in English we have 2 senses of lateness. We have someone who's just died, they're late, they're posthumous. But so that's the sense of late as being after the ultimate caesura, death. But there's also the sense of lateness in the way in which we use it in aesthetic discourse, which is to say late style, meaning the end of a life, the final period before the caesura, before death, rather than after it. Now, I think those 2 senses can be thought through, but they are 2 different senses. And I was talking mainly about the before the end of the life, before the death, rather than the posthumous sense of lateness. As for your first question about the relationship between end and telos and whether one can think an end without a telos, I mean, again, this is why I said, in a sense, one can answer these questions in a single way. It's about how you create meaning, how you assign meaning through these categories. And this is what Kant says in his essay Das Ende aller Dinge, that essentially eschatology, conceiving eschatology, is precisely a way of creating meaning, of making an end into telos. Of course, I'm not saying that it has that. I'm not necessarily defending that position. But that's how, and this is the point I'll come back to, that's how it's been constructed for those interesting reasons that I've just outlined.
Thank you. The floor now open for more questions, comments to come. We can always ask Gabi to offer a 4th question, but before that.
Perhaps I could come back while people think to pick up a couple of things you said in your response. You touched a couple of times on the emblematic figure of Faust, which I thought was very interesting. Faust and King Lear as the two of the big exemplars of late style, as it's traditionally understood. King Lear, who abjures his rough magic, and Faust too, in Goethe's sense. Now, of course, that's how it's been taken. I mean, Spengler takes the Faustian, he takes Faust as the emblem of modernity. For Spengler, the Faustian, modern is the Faustian, it's the word he uses, and specifically because it's the late, and he uses the terms. Now, of course, one can understand Faust and the Faustian in 2 broadly antithetical senses. One can understand his symbolic narrative resonance. One can understand that in the Goethean redemptive sense, or in the Marlovian sense of that refuses the redemption, refuses das ewig Weibliche, as it were, and isn't redeemed at the end. And again, that would correlate, I think, to these 2 broadly antithetical modes of lateness, the positive recuperative and the negative sense of mere senescence, mere decline, without any sense, as you said, Gabi, of purpose, recuperative purpose. So I thought it was interesting that you touched on Faust. But you're right, of course, Faust and King Lear are two of the emblematic figures of this sense of Western lateness.
Please, 2 questions you want to start? Please, we'll gather 2 or 3 questions.
Rather a simplistic question. Thank you very much for your very rich presentation on linking secularity with modernity, and especially in relation to temporality, because we're used to approach modernity in relation to present time. And it is this consciousness of the present that singled out modernity in relation to past traditions or even to future. There's a kind of articulation of temporalities for modernity, which makes the present, the consciousness of the present, very highlighted, very developed. And so what your move is to move away from that present temporality of the modern secular as the present time, but linking it with late, the notion of the late and the end, and more theological, which makes it possible for you to link it with more theological arguments rather than, if I understood you well, secularity as being something without religion. On the contrary, you re-articulate the coupled religious secularity through this different temporality. So I wanted to understand better your position in relation to all the other studies that focus on the present, secularity as the temporality of the present, which is even now is referred as presentism,
Sure.
like François
Hartog
and all. Yeah,
sure.
that's what I mean. How you situate your work. I had this idea that your move permits us to bring more theological issues and enriches, but how you would situate it.
Would you give me notes?
Sure.
That'd be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for provoking all these interesting thoughts. Just to reflect on the social sciences, they had a problem with thinking about what happens after modernity, because having put all their eggs in the basket of we are theorizing modernity, then you start to think, well, what comes next? So first of all, sociologists call it advanced modernity. Advanced is another variant. Then that seems very arrogant because you get a post-colonial critique, why is this any more advanced than something else? So then you move to multiple modernities, that's the next step in that move. And then, well, we've got obviously past modernities and so on. But I thought, and just linking that to Niloufer's comment, it was interesting, the quote you had in relation to Benjamin about moving to thinking about the whole much larger glacial or geological time, or moving to the whole thinking of humanity as a little blip in relation to the temporality of organic life. I think this is the really interesting move now, to shift your focus completely into very, very different modes of temporality, which alters the focus yet again, doesn't it? That isn't a question, it's just a set of random thoughts provoked by your very interesting paper.
Perhaps I could provide a set of random thoughts in response. Would that be allowed? In response really to both questions at this point. Thank you very much to both of you. Very, very interesting questions. I think to work backwards, the model from the social sciences, advanced modernity, I mean, I think that adjective is very interesting for several reasons. Partly because, as I've tried to suggest, the whole idea of modernity as late, or even as late style, late is very often a code for high culture. Late style as great style, and therefore advanced in the aesthetic sense. Therefore, if you take high culture as the kind of aesthetic variation of what you are calling advanced modernity in the social sciences sense, then I think that's right, and that's very often how lateness is understood, whether in the narrow aesthetic sense of late style or in the broader sense of modernity as late. And I think that's right. Although I would also say that I'm not necessarily saying, I think there are different discussions happening here. I'm not necessarily saying that we are at a particular moment in the 21st century, and one can conceptualize it in these terms, but I'm not making that argument that we're at that moment where we are in some particular late paradigm, if you want to call it that. What I've done in my work on this has tried to show that, so we moved into the postmodern period, we're moving out of the postmodern period perhaps, but that's been the great thing of the last 40 years, let's say. So it seems clear that the postmodern, to come back to Gabi's sense of lateness, is obviously an aesthetic of post. It's about being after something. What I've tried to show in my work on lateness is, in fact, not the postmodern, but the modern itself, and this takes us back to the first question, the modern itself, even before you get to the postmodern, can be underthought of in a very interesting sense as late. Now, what I mean by that, to come back to the first question, and Hartog and the régime d'histoire and his whole discussion of the présentisme, is that precisely if you flip, I mean, it's almost like a Copernican thing, if you flip the perspective on its head, we're used to thinking of the modern, and I suppose a fortiori of the modernist, as being about the new. That's our intuitive sense, or about the new, about the present. But if you flip history on its head, then you can equally say that the modern is late because it comes after everything else. I mean, this is the alternative way of seeing it that goes back to Bacon, saying modernity, the early modern is the old age of the world. Descartes, who says, c'est nous qui sommes les anciens. So there's a lineage for this too. And actually, I think that there's legitimacy in flipping the perspective, and it suddenly becomes very interesting because it's a very simple inversion of perspective, but it opens up this whole range of consequences. And in fact, when you start thinking that through, I mean, just to focus on the modernist period, let alone the rest of modernity, we think of modernism as, you know, the Ezra Pound cliche, let's make it new. But what does that mean? That's predicated, and Pound himself says things to this end, that's predicated on his very strong sense of coming at the end, of being at the end in this late period of Western culture. That's precisely why he wants to break it and make it new. And that's an aesthetic he shares, obviously, with Eliot and others. And if you look across lots of these modernist thinkers across European literature, you look at Paul Valéry, who's writing in his essays about Europe in the immediate post-War I period, the crisis of the European mind. He says, we now know we are mortal. The European civilizations are mortal at the end of this period, the pathos of the post-World War period. Valéry, who then conceptualizes the moderns as being embarrassed, he uses the word gêné, as being embarrassed by their lateness, embarrassed by the modernity because they come at the end of history. One could take lots of examples, and this is particularly strong, and this is one of the reasons I concentrated on this today, particularly strong in the German tradition, because there are a range of very interesting reasons for why I think the discourse of late style comes out of Germany. Over the course of the 19th century, both reasons historical, political, aesthetic, I think also purely contingent. Goethe became such a big model for late style. He happened to be German, Beethoven too. There are a number of very interesting reasons for that, but nonetheless, it's very clear that this discourse is very largely Germanic within the European world. And when you get to German modernism, this sense of the modernist, let alone the modern, but the modernist as actually being an aesthetics of lateness is very, very strong. And you could, time and again, there are thinkers from, as I've mentioned a few today, but there are many others one could look at. And one sees the sense of, so then this takes us back in a sense to the present, because how do you understand, to use my example of the modernist, the avant-garde, you can understand that as the most progressive, but that can also mean advanced, the advanced modernity. It's the most advanced, which can also mean it's the latest in both senses. It's the latest because it's the newest, but it's also the latest because it's the oldest, because it comes after everything else. And I mentioned Adorno. Adorno's understanding of modernist writers, his two favorite writers, Kafka and Beckett, is predicated upon his understanding of late style, on his understanding of Beethoven and various others, and how he conceptualizes late style as being fundamentally modernist, avant-garde, this aesthetic of fracture and fragment and irreconciliation. So there are all sorts of absolutely fascinating ways, I think, in which one can actually rethink that particular paradigm of présentisme. I'm not necessarily saying we're in that particular period in 2016. I'm looking back across modern culture, modern literature more generally.
We are not too late in this session, so I can ask you another question. All right? A small one, reflecting your last... Sure. Thank you. Just a minor question regarding your last remark on modernism. Because one category seems to vanish or to collapse in the reconstruction is the future.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems that, you know, in being too late or at the latest style, although something is left, right time that is left, yet it's very narrow, right? I mean, the very idea of future turns very narrow, right? Something to admit, right? And this had to do with the eschatological, right, idea of time, that it has to do with this idea of narrowing the time-space itself, right? It is the next moment where the decisions should be made. So this is one remark on what is the future of this, right? If there is any. And again, nevertheless, you know, they all understood themselves as beginners, right? This is, again, this dialectic. You know, King Lear is a child, right, in many terms, turning to a kind of, you know, at the beginning. So how to reflect beginning and future in such a time structure, right, when it's always too late?
Thank you very much. Very interesting thoughts. To start with your last example, King Lear, indeed he does see himself in those terms, but of course that itself is one of the great tropes of lateness, senescence that seeks rejuvenation. And certainly Shakespeare and Lear, but also elsewhere in the late romances as they were. And indeed, there's an interesting anecdote about how Shakespeare's own late work was constructed in the 1870s and 80s by Edward Dowden. He created the whole category of the late romances, and he precisely says that what unites them is this search for a return to childhood and the innocence of childhood. But of course, it's lost. It's no longer naive childhood in Schiller's sense. It's sentimental. So the fact that King Lear and others look back to childhood is itself part of the trope of lateness and late style. It's the sense of looking back to the beginning from the end of a life. More broadly, you mentioned what's the perspective for the future here, if I can summarize your question somewhat crudely. Of course, that's a very interesting question. And one of the ways of thinking about this is to disassociate late style from the narrower sense of late style of an individual artist to lateness as a broader epochal phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, one of the differences is that late style, by definition, if you apply it to an individual, is end stopped. I mean, we're going to die. You know, an individual's going to die. Whereas lateness as a broader epochal phenomenon, and Nietzsche is very clear on this, to take one example, and this is part of its pathos, can hope for a generation in a next generation, as it were. I mean, Nietzsche says we are latecomers. We need to try to become. We're latecomers. We need to try to become firstcomers. He contrasts the pair of Spätlinge and Erstlinge. Yeah. He says wir sind Spätlinge, wollen wir Erstlinge werden. We want to become firstcomers. It's out of the pathos of lateness that he seeks that. It's precisely because there is a dialectical relationship between those two things. So I think you're absolutely right. One has to think these two things as a pair. But as I say, there are nuances in the categories of lateness that one applies in terms of whether or not there is an implied future.
Thank you very much. So we have a future.